spooky place.
Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. Take a deep breath and glance at the closest closet or wardrobe in your room. Notice anything unusual? Good. Now, settle in, because by the time this story is over, you won't be sleeping tonight or ever looking at a closet the same way again. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. Room 303. The rain lashed against the windows of the old, crumbling hotel as the weary businessman, Thomas Grayson, dragged his suitcase through the dimly lit lobby. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled of mildew and neglect. The receptionist, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, barely looked up as she handed him the key to room 207. "Checkout is at 11 a.m., she said in a monotone voice. Then, as if remembering something, she added, "And whatever you do, don't go near room 303, no matter what you hear." Thomas raised an eyebrow, too exhausted to question her. He nodded, took the key, and made his way to the elevator, its rusty doors groaning as they closed behind him. The hotel was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of the storm outside. Room 207 was small and sparsely furnished, the bed sagging in the middle and the wallpaper peeling at the corners. Thomas tossed his suitcase onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind. He closed his eyes, hoping for a few hours of rest before his early morning meeting. But sleep did not come easily. At first, it was just a faint sound, a whisper, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Thomas turned over, pulling the thin blanket over his head. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was sobbing, heart-wrenching, desperate sobs that seemed to echo through the walls. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from the hallway. Against his better judgment, he crept to the door and pressed his ear against it. The sobs were clearer now, accompanied by a faint, desperate whisper. "Help me, please." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was an edge to it, a raw, primal fear that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The receptionist's warning echoed in his mind, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled him to act. He opened the door a crack and peered into the hallway. The dim light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The sobbing was coming from the end of the hall, near room 303. Thomas stepped out, his bare feet cold against the worn carpet. The air grew heavier with each step, the sobs growing louder, more desperate. When he reached room 303, he paused. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, crimson light spilled out from the crack. The whispers were clearer now, overlapping, pleading. "Help me. Please. They took my eyes. They took my eyes." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, pressing his eye to the keyhole. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was bathed in a deep, dark red light, as if the very walls were bleeding. In the center of the room stood a figure, a woman, her back to him, her long, tangled hair hanging down like a curtain. She was wearing a tattered white dress, stained with what looked like blood. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, her hands clawing at her face. And then, as if sensing his presence, she stopped. The room fell silent. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the woman slowly turned her head, revealing her face. Her eyes were gone, empty, gaping sockets stared back at him, dripping with thick, crimson liquid. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." Thomas stumbled back, his legs giving way as he fell to the floor. The door to room 303 slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the hallway plunged into darkness. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his room, slamming the door behind him and locking it. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, clutching his knees to his chest, too terrified to sleep. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, seeping through the walls like a poison. When morning finally came, Thomas packed his things as quickly as he could and hurried down to the lobby. The receptionist was there, her pale face even more ashen than before. Who was staying in room 303? Thomas demanded, his voice shaking. The receptionist's hands trembled as she set down her pen. Room 303 has been empty for years, she said quietly. A woman was murdered there. Her eyes were gouged out. They say all that's left of her spirit is red. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. I saw her, he whispered. She spoke to me. The receptionist's eyes widened in fear. You saw her? Then, it's already begun. What do you mean? Thomas asked, his voice rising in panic. The receptionist leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman in room 303. She wasn't the only one. There were others. They say the hotel was built on cursed ground, and the spirits of the dead linger here, trapped. Once you see her, she won't let you go. She'll follow you, until she takes your eyes too. Thomas shook his head, refusing to believe her. No, this is insane. I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here. He turned and rushed out of the hotel, the receptionist's warning ringing in his ears. The storm had passed, but the sky was still overcast, the air heavy with the promise of more rain. Thomas hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of his office, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the hotel as possible. But as the taxi pulled away, he caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the shadows of the hotel's entrance. A woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by her hair. And even from a distance, he could see the faint, crimson glow of her empty eye sockets. The whispers followed him all the way to the office. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to convince himself it had all been a nightmare, a trick of his exhausted mind. But the whispers persisted, growing louder each night. He began to see flashes of red in the corners of his vision, and his dreams were haunted by the woman in room 303, her grotesque smile and dripping, empty eyes. One night, as he lay in bed, the whispers became unbearable. They surrounded him, suffocating him, until he could no longer tell if they were coming from outside or inside his own mind. Help me, please. They took my eyes, they took my eyes. Thomas screamed, covering his ears, but the whispers only grew louder. And then he felt it, a cold, wet touch on his face, like fingers brushing against his skin. He opened his eyes, and there she was, hovering above him, her bloodied hands reaching for his face. The last thing Thomas saw was the deep, dark red of her empty sockets before everything went black. When Thomas didn't show up for work the next day, his colleagues grew concerned. A search was launched, and eventually, he was found in his apartment, his body cold and lifeless. His eyes were gone, gouged out as if by some unseen force. And on the wall above his bed, written in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "Now you see what I see." The hotel still stands, its halls silent and empty, save for the faint whispers that echo through the night. And if you ever find yourself checking in a room 207, remember the receptionist warning. Don't go near room 303, no matter what you hear. The story of Thomas Grayson's death spread like wildfire, but the authorities quickly dismissed it as a tragic, albeit bizarre, suicide. The hotel, however, became a local legend. Urban explorers, thrill seekers, and paranormal investigators flocked to the crumbling building, eager to uncover its secrets. But none of them stayed long. Some claimed to hear the whispers. Others swore they saw the crimson light seeping from under the door of room 303. And a few never returned. 6 months later, Maggie Carter, a freelance journalist specializing in the occult, stood in the hotel lobby, her camera slung over her shoulder and a notebook in hand. She had read about Thomas Grayson's death and the hotel's dark history, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The receptionist, the same gaunt woman who had warned Thomas, eyed her warily. "You're here for room 303, aren't you?" the receptionist asked, her voice trembling. Maggie nodded. "I want to know what really happened." To Thomas, to the woman, to everyone. The receptionist hesitated, then slid a key across the counter. "Room 207. And don't say I didn't warn you." Maggie took the key and headed upstairs, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. The hallway was just as Thomas had described, dim, creaky, and suffused with an unnatural silence. She unlocked the door to room 207 and stepped inside, the musty air making her nose wrinkle. As night fell, Maggie set up her equipment, a digital recorder, a camera, and a few motion sensors. She had done this countless times before, but something about this place felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. She sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. It didn't take long. The whispers began just after midnight, faint at first, like the rustle of fabric, but growing louder, more insistent. Maggie's recorder picked up the sound, though she couldn't make out the words. She grabbed her camera and crept into the hallway, following the sound to room 303. The door was slightly ajar, just as Thomas had described. A faint crimson light spilled out from the crack, casting an eerie glow on the floor. Maggie's breath quickened as she pressed her eye to the keyhole. The room was bathed in red, the walls pulsating as if alive. In the center stood the woman, her back to the door, her tangled hair swaying as if caught in an unseen breeze. Maggie's hands trembled as she raised her camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the room, and the woman's head snapped around. Her face was a grotesque mask of blood and emptiness, her eye sockets dripping crimson. Maggie stumbled back, her heart racing, but the door to room 303 swung open, revealing the woman in full. "You shouldn't have looked," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in Maggie's mind. Maggie turned and ran, her camera swinging wildly from its strap. She slammed the door to room 207 behind her and locked it, her chest heaving. The whispers followed, growing louder, more desperate. "Help me. Please, they took my eyes, they took my eyes." Maggie pressed her hands to her ears, but the whispers seeped into her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She grabbed her recorder and played back the audio, hoping to make sense of the words. But what she heard made her blood run cold. The whispers weren't just coming from the woman. They were overlapping, dozens of voices, all pleading, all desperate. And beneath them, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something ancient and malevolent, the truth unveiled. The next morning, Maggie returned to the lobby, her face pale and her hands shaking. The receptionist looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "You saw her, didn't you?" the receptionist asked. Maggie nodded. "But it's not just her. There are others. So many others. What is this place?" The receptionist sighed, her eyes downcast. The hotel was built on cursed ground. Long before it was a hotel, it was a prison, a place where the worst criminals were sent to die. But it wasn't just a prison. It was a place of experimentation. The warden believed he could extract the essence of the human soul, and he used the prisoners as his test subjects. He gouged out their eyes, believing they were the windows to the soul. Maggie's stomach churned, and the woman in room 303. Her name was Eliza, the receptionist said. She was the warden's final victim. He killed her in that room, but her spirit, it didn't rest. It festered, feeding on the pain and suffering of the others. Now, she's trapped here, and she drags anyone who sees her in her nightmare. Maggie's mind raced. There has to be a way to stop her, to free the others. The receptionist shook her head. Many have tried. None have succeeded. The only way to escape her is to never look. But once you've seen her, she owns you. The descent. Maggie refused to accept that. She spent the next few days researching the hotel's history, uncovering old records and testimonies from former staff. She learned that the warden had buried his victims in the basement, their bodies sealed behind a wall. And she found references to a ritual, a way to banish the spirits, but at a great cost. That night, armed with a crowbar and a vial of holy water, Maggie descended into the basement. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She found the hidden wall and began to chip away at it, her hands trembling with every strike. When the wall finally gave way, she was met with a horrifying sight. Dozens of skeletons, their eye sockets empty, their bones stained with dried blood. And in the center of the room was a crude altar covered in symbols and offerings. Maggie poured the holy water over the altar and began the ritual, reciting the words she had found in the warden's journal. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, more frantic. And then the woman appeared. Eliza's spirit loomed over Maggie, her face twisted in rage. "You cannot banish me," she hissed. "I am eternal." Maggie stood her ground, her voice steady. "You're not eternal. You're trapped, and I'm setting you free." The ritual reached its climax, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The whispers turned to screams, and the crimson glow intensified, then faded. When the light disappeared, the basement was silent. Maggie emerged from the hotel the next morning, her face pale but resolute. The receptionist was gone, the lobby empty. The hotel seemed different, lighter. The whispers were gone. But as Maggie walked away, she felt a cold touch on her shoulder. She turned, but no one was there. And in the reflection of a nearby window, she saw a faint, crimson glow in her eyes. The whispers had stopped, but the curse had found a new host. The hotel was demolished a year later, the land deemed uninhabitable. But the stories persisted. Some say the spirits still wander the grounds, searching for their lost eyes. Others claim to see a woman in a tattered white dress, her face hidden by her hair, standing in the shadows. And if you ever find yourself near the old hotel site, remember, don't look, no matter what you hear, because once you see her, she'll never let you go. The demolition of the hotel did little to quell the legends. If anything, it only fueled them. The land where the hotel once stood remained barren, a desolate patch of earth that even the hardiest weeds refused to touch. Locals avoided it, claiming the air fell heavier there, as if the ground itself was alive and breathing. But for Maggie Carter, the horror was far from over. 1 year later, Maggie had tried to move on. She published her findings, exposing the hotel's dark history and the atrocities committed by the warden. The story went viral, but brought her no peace. The whispers had stopped, but the crimson glow in her eyes lingered, a constant reminder of the curse she had tried to break. She began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing in the dark. At first, she dismissed them as stress, the aftermath of her ordeal. But then the dream started. Every night, she found herself back in the hotel, standing in front of room 303. The door would creak open, and Eliza would step out, her hollow eyes dripping with blood. She would reach for Maggie, her bony fingers brushing against her face, and whisper, "You didn't free me. You trapped me inside you." Maggie would wake up screaming, her sheets drenched in sweat. But the worst part was the feeling that something was inside her, something dark and malevolent, clawing its way to the surface point one night. Maggie couldn't take it anymore. She drove back to the site of the hotel, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. The land was eerily quiet, the moon casting an unnatural glow over the barren ground. As she stepped out her car, she felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step she took. They weren't just in her head this time. They were all around her, overlapping, pleading, demanding. "Help us! Free us!" They took our eyes. Maggie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "What do you want from me?" she shouted into the darkness. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the air. The whispers turned to screams, and the crimson glow returned, illuminating the night. Maggie fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices overwhelmed her. And then she saw them. Dozens of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted in agony, their eye sockets empty and dripping with blood. They surrounded her, their hands reaching out, their voices merging into a single, deafening cry. "You didn't free us. You trapped us." Maggie's vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the ground, as if the earth itself was swallowing her. The last thing she saw was Eliza's face, her grotesque smile inches from her own. "Now you'll see what we see," Eliza whispered. When Maggie woke up, she was back in her car, the sun rising over the horizon. She felt different. The whispers were gone, but the crimson glow in her eyes was brighter than ever. And when she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw them, the spirits, their hollow eyes staring back at her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her hands moved on their own, turning the key in the ignition and driving away from the sight. She had no control over her body, no say in where she was going. The spirits had taken over. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen in the nearby town. People reported seeing a woman with glowing red eyes wandering the streets at night. Some claimed to hear whispers in their homes, faint but persistent, growing louder as the nights went on. And then, the disappearances started. One by one, people vanished. Men, women, even children. Their bodies were never found, but their loved ones reported seeing them in their dreams, their eyes gouged out, their faces twisted in agony. The town descended into chaos. Some blamed Maggie, claiming she had brought the curse back with her. Others believed the spirits had grown stronger, feeding on the fear and despair of the living. But no one could explain the crimson light that now seeped from the ground where the hotel once stood. Maggie, or what was left of her, knew what had to be done. The spirits had used her to spread the curse, but they had also given her the knowledge to end it. She returned to the side of the hotel, her body moving on its own, guided by the spirits. She dug into the ground, her hands bleeding as she uncovered the remains of the warden's victims. She arranged the bones in a circle, placing Eliza's skeleton in the center. And then she began the ritual. The whispers returned, louder than ever, but Maggie's voice cut through them, steady and resolute. She recited the incantation, her crimson eyes glowing brighter with each word. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. And then the spirits appeared. They surrounded her, their faces twisted in rage and desperation. Eliza stepped forward, her hollow eyes staring into Maggie's soul. "You cannot banish us," she hissed. "We are eternal." Maggie smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "No," she said, "but I can join you." With that, she plunged a knife in her chest, her blood spilling onto the bones. The spirits screamed, their forms dissolving into the crimson light. The ground shook violently, and then silence. The town was never the same after that. The disappearances stopped, and the whispers faded, but the land where the hotel once stood remained barren. Some say the spirits were finally laid to rest. Others believe they're still there, waiting for the next host. And if you ever find yourself near the site, remember, don't look, no matter what you hear, because once you see the crimson glow, it's already too late. Years later, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night on the cursed land. They brought cameras, flashlights, and a Ouija board, laughing nervously as they set up camp. But as the sun set and the whispers began, their laughter turned to screams. The next morning, their camp was found abandoned, their equipment scattered and broken, and in the center of the circle, written in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "We see you." The reflection in the window. The hotel was a grand, old building, its walls whispering secrets of a century gone by. It stood tall in the heart of the city, its ornate facade hiding the darkness within. Clara had chosen it for its charm, its history, and the promise of a quiet night. She was a woman who prided herself on her independence, her ability to navigate the world alone. But that night, the world she thought she knew would unravel. She checked in late. The receptionist, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, handing her the key to room 1010 with a trembling hand. 10th floor, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Elevators to your left. Clara barely noticed his unease, too tired from her journey to care. The elevator creaked as it ascended, the dim light flickering, casting long shadows on the walls. She shrugged it off. Old buildings had their quirks. Room 1010 was spacious, with a large window overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, the skyline glittering like a sea of stars. Clara unpacked, took a quick shower, and slipped into bed, the exhaustion of the day pulling her into a deep sleep. But sleep didn't last. She woke abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was pitch black, the city lights outside muted by heavy curtains. Something felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Clara sat up, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the window, a shadowy figure stood behind her. Her breath hitched. The figure was tall, its outline blurred, as if it were made of smoke. It loomed over her, motionless, its presence oppressive. Clara's mind raced. She was alone in the room. She had locked the door, hadn't she? She forced herself to turn around, her body moving as if through molasses. Nothing. The room was empty. The door was still locked, the chain securely in place. Clara let out a shaky laugh. "Just my imagination," she whispered, though her voice trembled. She glanced back at the window. The reflection was clear now, showing only her own wide-eyed face. She lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, chasing away the night's horrors. Clara felt foolish as she dressed, chiding herself for letting her imagination run wild. She decided to put the incident behind her, but as she passed the reception desk on her way out, something made her pause. The receptionist from the night before was gone, replaced by a young woman with a nervous smile. Clara hesitated, then approached. "Good morning," she said, forcing a casual tone. "I was just wondering, does this hotel have a history of, hauntings?" The receptionist's smile faltered. Her face went pale, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Why do you ask?" she whispered. Clara shrugged, tried to appear nonchalant. "Oh, just something strange last night. I thought I saw someone in my room, but it was probably nothing." The receptionist's eyes widened. "What room were you in?" 1010. The color drained from the receptionist's face. She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely audible, "your room was on the 10th floor. There's no balcony, no ledge, and no way anyone could have been standing behind you." Clara's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" The receptionist leaned closer, her voice trembling. "Room 1010. It's been closed for years. No one stays there. Not since the incident." Clara's mind raced. "What incident?" The receptionist hesitated, then sighed. 10 years ago, a woman was staying in that room. She was traveling alone, like you. One night, she woke up screaming, claiming there was a man in her room. The staff searched the place, but there was no one there. The next morning, she was found dead, hanging from the ceiling fan. The police ruled it a suicide, but she trailed off, her eyes darting to the elevator. But guests have reported seeing a shadowy figure in that room ever since. We keep it locked. No one is supposed to go in there. Clara's blood ran cold, but I stayed there last night. I have the key. The receptionist shook her head. That's impossible. The key to 1010 was destroyed years ago. It's been sealed off. Clara reached in her pocket and pulled out the key. The receptionist stared at it, her face a mask of horror. That's not one of our keys, she stammered. Where did you get that? Before Clara could respond, the elevator dinged. The doors slid open, revealing the gaunt receptionist from the night before. His eyes locked onto Clara, and a slow, sinister smile spread across his face. Enjoy your stay, ma'am, he asked, his voice dripping with malice. Clara backed away, her heart pounding. Who are you? She demanded. The man stepped out of the elevator, his movements unnaturally smooth. I'm the night manager, he said. I've been here a long time, longer than you can imagine. The receptionist behind the desk gasped. But you're not. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. Oh, but I am, he interrupted. And so is she. Clara turned to run, but the man was suddenly in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes were black voids, his skin pale and waxy. You shouldn't have come here, he hissed. But now that you're here, you'll never leave. Clara screamed, but no sound came out. The world around her shifted, the hotel lobby dissolving into darkness. She was back in room 1010, the shadowy figure standing behind her once more. This time, she didn't turn around. She couldn't. Her body was frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath on her neck. Welcome home, it whispered, and then the room went dark. The next morning, the hotel was quiet. The receptionist behind the desk glanced at the elevator, a shiver running down her spine. She hadn't seen the woman from room 1010 check out, but the key was back in its place, the room locked and undisturbed. Or so she thought. As she turned to attend to another guest, the elevator dinged. The doors opened, revealing an empty car. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadowy figure standing inside, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. The elevator doors closed, and the figure was gone. But room 1010 was no longer empty. The hotel staff tried to forget about Clara. They told themselves she had checked out early, that she had simply vanished into the city like so many guests before her. But the receptionist who had spoken to her that morning couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. She avoided the elevator, took the stairs instead, and refused to even glance at the door to room 1010. But the hotel had a way of pulling people back in, of making sure its secrets were never truly buried. A week after Clara's disappearance, a new guest arrived. His name was Daniel, a travel writer researching haunted locations for his next book. He had heard rumors about the hotel, whispers of a room that was permanently locked, of shadows that moved on their own. He was intrigued, not frightened. After all, he didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. The same gaunt receptionist who had greeted Clara checked him in. His name tag read Mr. Graves, though Daniel found the name oddly fitting. Graves handed him a key with a sly smile. Room 1010, he said. I think you'll find it inspiring. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I thought that room was closed. Graves' smile widened. Not for you. The elevator ride to the 10th floor was uneventful, though Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet worn and faded. Room 1010 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Daniel pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was exactly as Clara had found it, spacious, with a large window overlooking the city. But there was something off about it, something Daniel couldn't quite place. The air was too still, too heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He set his bag down and began to unpack, determined to make the most of his stay. That night, Daniel woke to the sound of whispering. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the window was closed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though he couldn't make out the words. He sat up, his heart racing, and that's when he saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Daniel froze. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching him. Daniel reached for the lamp on the nightstand, fumbling for the switch. When the light came on, the figure was gone. He spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, his eyes darting around the room. By morning, he was exhausted but determined. He had come here for a story, and by God, he was going to get one. Daniel spent the day researching the hotel's history. He visited the local library, scoured old newspapers, and even spoke to a few longtime residents of the city. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The hotel had been built in the late 1800s, a luxurious retreat for the city's elite. But over the years, it had gained a reputation for tragedy. Guests had gone missing. Others had died under mysterious circumstances. Room 1010, in particular, seemed to be a focal point for the horrors. In the 1920s, a young woman had thrown herself from the window, though there was no balcony or ledge to stand on. In the 1950s, a businessman had been found dead in the room, his face frozen in a mask of terror. And then there was Clara, the woman who had vanished just a week ago. Daniel returned to the hotel that evening, his mind racing. He was no longer sure he wanted to stay in room 1010, but something compelled him to go back. As he stepped off the elevator, he noticed something strange. The hallway seemed longer than before, the door to room 1010 farther away. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers returning, louder now, more urgent. He reached the door and hesitated. The key felt heavy in his hand, as if it didn't want to be used. But Daniel was a stubborn man. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was different. The furniture was older, the wallpaper peeling, the air thick with the scent of decay. The window was open, though Daniel was certain he had closed it that morning. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. That's when he saw her. A woman stood on the other side of the window, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. She reached out to him, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Daniel stumbled back, his mind reeling. "Who are you?" he whispered. The woman's lips formed a single word: "Help." Before Daniel could respond, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The shadowy figure from the night before was there, its form more solid now, its features becoming clearer. It was a man, tall and thin, his face twisted into a cruel smile. His eyes were black voids, his skin pale and waxy. "You shouldn't have come back," the man said, his voice echoing as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel backed away, his mind racing. "What do you want?" The man's smile widened. "Your soul." Daniel turned to run, but the woman from the window was there now, blocking his path. Her face was a mask of sorrow, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't know what to do. He was trapped between the two figures, the room growing colder with each passing second. The man stepped closer, his hand reaching out, his fingers long and bony. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the hotel staff found room 1010 empty. Daniel's belongings were still there, his laptop open on the desk, but there was no sign of him. The key to the room was on the nightstand, as if it had been waiting for them. Mr. Graves stood in the doorway, a satisfied smile on his face. "Another satisfied guest," he murmured, his voice dripping with malice. The receptionist who had spoken to Clara watched from the hallway, her face pale. She knew better than to ask questions. She had seen the shadowy figure in the elevator again, its hollow eyes staring straight at her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it came for her too. The hotel remained open, its secrets buried deep within its walls. But every now and then, a guest would check into room 1010, drawn by its dark history. And every time, the shadowy figure would be waiting, its hollow eyes watching, its cruel smile growing wider. Because the hotel always got what it wanted, and it was always hungry. The hotel's reputation grew, not as a place of luxury, but as a place of nightmares. Travelers whispered about it in hushed tones, warning each other to stay away. Yet, there were always those who couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. Room 1010 became a macabre pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, ghost hunters, and the morbidly curious. And the hotel welcomed them all, with open arms and a hunger that could never be satisfied. Months after Daniel's disappearance, a young couple arrived at the hotel. Emma and Jake were amateur paranormal investigators, armed with cameras, EMF meters, and a naive sense of invincibility. They had heard the stories about room 1010 and were determined to uncover the truth. Mr. Graves greeted them at the reception desk, his hollow eyes glinting with amusement. Room 1010, I presume, he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Emma nodded eagerly. Yes, please. We've heard so much about it. Graves handed them the key, his fingers brushing against Emma's palm. She shuddered, though she couldn't explain why. Enjoy your stay, he said, his smile too wide, too sharp. The couple made their way to the 10th floor, their excitement palpable. But as they stepped off the elevator, the atmosphere shifted. The hallway seemed darker, the air colder. The door to room 1010 loomed at the end of the hall, its presence ominous. Jake unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was exactly as they had expected, spacious, with a large window overlooking the city. But there was something off about it, something they couldn't quite place. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. They set up their equipment, determined to capture evidence of the supernatural. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as they were about to give up, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Their breath came out in visible puffs, and the EMF meter spiked. Emma's eyes widened. Do you feel that? Jake nodded, his heart racing. Something's here. That's when they saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Emma grabbed her camera, her hands trembling as she pressed record. The figure stepped closer, its features becoming clearer. It was the same man Daniel had seen, tall and thin, his face twisted into a cruel smile. Who are you? Jake demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised a bony finger and pointed to the window. Emma and Jake turned, their blood running cold. The woman from the window was there again, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She reached out to them, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. Help me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake took a step forward, but Emma grabbed his arm. Don't, she warned. We don't know what she is. The man in the corner laughed, the sound echoing through the room. Too late, he said, his voice dripping with malice. The door slammed shut behind them, the lock clicking into place. Emma and Jake spun around, their hearts pounding. The man was gone, but the woman from the window was still there, her face twisted in sorrow. Please, she begged. You have to help me. Emma's mind raced. How? What do you want? The woman's eyes filled with tears. He's trapped me here. He's trapped all of us. You have to break the cycle. Before Emma could respond, the room began to change. The walls peeled away, revealing a nightmarish landscape. The floor dissolved into a void, the ceiling stretching into infinity. Emma and Jake clung to each other, their screams swallowed by the darkness. And then, everything went silent. The next morning, the hotel staff found room 1010 empty. Emma and Jake's equipment was still there, their cameras and EMF meters scattered across the floor. But there was no sign of the couple. Mr. Graves stood in the doorway, his hollow eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Another satisfied guest," he murmured, his voice dripping with malice. The receptionist who had spoken to Clara watched from the hallway, her face pale. She had seen the shadowy figure in the elevator again, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. And she knew it was only a matter of time before it came for her, too. But the hotel's hunger was insatiable. It demanded more souls, more suffering. And so, it continued to lure unsuspecting guests to room 1010, each one falling victim to its dark secrets. One night, a young woman arrived at the hotel. She was alone, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She approached the reception desk, her movements unnaturally smooth. Mr. Graves greeted her with a sly smile. "Room 1010, I presume." The woman nodded, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Yes," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for this." Graves handed her the key, his fingers brushing against her palm. She shuddered, though not from fear. She was no ordinary guest. She was something else entirely. As she made her way to the 10th floor, the hotel seemed to tremble, as if it sensed her presence. The door to room 1010 loomed at the end of the hall, its presence ominous. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. The shadowy figure was there, waiting for her. It stepped closer, its features becoming clearer. It was the same man, tall and thin, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The woman smiled, her lips curling into a cruel smirk. "I'm the one who's going to end this." And then, the room went dark. The next morning, the hotel staff found room 1010 empty. The key was on the nightstand, as if it had been waiting for them. But something was different. The air was lighter, the silence less oppressive. Mr. Graves stood in the doorway, his hollow eyes filled with fear. He knew something had changed. The hotel's hunger had been sated, its secrets exposed, and the shadowy figure was gone. But the woman was still there, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She stood in the corner of the room, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Your turn," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. And then, everything went black. The hotel stood silent, its grand facade hiding the chaos within. The woman, no longer a guest, but something far more powerful, had unraveled the dark tapestry of room 1010. She was no ordinary soul. She was a revenant, a spirit of vengeance, bound to the mortal plane to destroy those who thrived on suffering. And the hotel, with its endless hunger, had made a fatal mistake by luring her in. The night she arrived, the hotel had trembled. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Mr. Graves, the gaunt receptionist who had served as the hotel's harbinger of doom for decades, felt it too. His hollow eyes widened as he handed her the key to room 1010. For the first time in his unnatural existence, he felt fear. The woman, her name lost to time, her purpose clear, ascended to the 10th floor. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the door to room 1010 pulsating like a beating heart. She stepped inside, and the room came alive. The walls bled shadows, the air thickened with whispers, and the figure, the tall, thin man with a cruel smile, emerged from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed, his voice echoing like a death knell. The woman smiled, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "I've come to end this." The man lunged at her, his form shifting into a monstrous abomination of smoke and bone. But the woman was ready. She raised her hand, and the room erupted in a blinding light. The shadows screamed, the walls cracked, and the man's form began to dissolve. "No," he roared, his voice filled with desperation. "You can't destroy me. I am eternal." The woman stepped closer, her voice calm but filled with power. You are nothing but a parasite, feeding on the fear of the innocent. Your eternity ends tonight. With a final, deafening roar, the man disintegrated, his essence scattering like ash in the wind. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the hotel's dark heart was torn out. But the woman's work wasn't done. She turned her attention to the hotel itself, its walls pulsing with a sickly energy. It was alive, a living entity sustained by the suffering of its victims. She walked through the halls, her presence causing the building to shudder and groan. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder, pleading for mercy. She reached the lobby, where Mr. Graves stood, his face pale and twisted with fear. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The woman smiled, her eyes glowing brighter. "I am Justice." She raised her hand, and the lobby erupted in flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the walls, the floors, the very essence of the hotel. Mr. Graves screamed as the flames engulfed him, his form dissolving into ash. The hotel's final moments were filled with the screams of the trapped souls, their cries echoing through the halls as they were finally set free. The woman stood in the center of the inferno, her form glowing like a beacon of light. She had done what she came to do. As the sun rose over the city, the hotel was gone. All that remained was a smoldering ruin, its dark secrets reduced to ash. The woman stood amidst the wreckage, her form fading as her purpose was fulfilled. She had destroyed the hotel, freed the trapped souls, and ended the cycle of suffering. But as she faded, she felt a presence, a familiar, malevolent force. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she saw him. The man, the shadowy figure, stood amidst the ruins, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You think you've won," he whispered, his voice filled with venom. "But I am eternal. I will return." The woman smiled, her form dissolving into light. "And I will be waiting." Years later, a new building rose from the ashes of the old hotel. It was modern, sleek, and devoid of the dark history that had plagued its predecessor. But deep within its foundation, buried beneath layers of concrete and steel, a single key lay hidden, the key to room 1010. And in the shadows, a figure watched, its hollow eyes gleaming with anticipation. The cycle had ended, but the darkness never truly dies. The extra guest. The rain hammered against the windows of the budget motel, its rhythmic patter doing little to soothe the young couple's nerves. The neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the room. Emily and Jake had been driving for hours, and the storm had forced them to stop at the first available place. The motel was old, its walls stained with years of neglect, but it was cheap, and they were exhausted. As they settled into room 212, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of mildew, mixed with something metallic, lingered in the room. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the corners, the closet, and finally, the bed. It was an old, creaky thing with a faded floral bedspread that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. "Jake, do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" he replied, tossing their bags onto the floor. "It's just an old motel, Em. Don't let your imagination run wild." But Emily couldn't shake the unease. As they prepared for bed, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her. Jake, ever the skeptic, teased her about her paranoia, but even he couldn't deny the strange atmosphere in the room. The clock on the nightstand read 3:07 a.m. when the first sound woke them. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft shuffling like fabric brushing against the floor. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay perfectly still, straining to hear. "Jake," she whispered, nudging him. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" Before she could answer, the sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from beneath the bed. Emily's breath caught in her throat as a faint whisper filled the room, so soft it was almost inaudible. "He's in my bed." Jake sat up, his face pale. What the hell was that? They both froze, their eyes locked on the edge of the bed. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "He's in my bed. Get him out." Emily screamed, scrambling to turn on the lamp. The bulb flickered weakly, casting a dim light over the room. Jake jumped out of bed, his fists clenched, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was there. But when they looked under the bed, there was nothing. Just dust and a few forgotten items. A sock, a crumpled receipt, and a small, rusted key. "It's just the wind or something," Jake said, though his voice trembled. "Let's just try to get some sleep." Emily didn't argue, but she knew it wasn't the wind. The whisper had been too clear, too deliberate. She spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, her eyes fixed on the edge of the mattress, waiting for the sound to return. The next morning, they packed their bags quickly, eager to leave the room behind. As they checked out, Emily hesitated at the front desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, gave them a polite smile. "How was your stay?" she asked. Emily exchanged a glance with Jake before speaking. It was fine, but did anything unusual ever happen in room 212? The receptionist's smile faltered, and she glanced around nervously. "Why do you ask?" "We heard something last night," Jake said, his tone serious. "A voice. It said, 'He's in my bed.'" The receptionist's face went pale, and she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You got room 212. A few years ago, a man was found dead under the bed. He'd been missing for weeks before they discovered him. Some guests still say they hear him, like he's still there, waiting." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Waiting for what? The receptionist hesitated, then sighed. "They say he was murdered. His killer was never caught. Some people think he's still looking for justice or revenge." As they drove away from the motel, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the key they'd found under the bed. It was small and rusted, with a faint engraving on the side. She turned it over in her hands, her mind racing. "Jake, what if this key is connected to what happened in that room?" she asked. He glanced at her, his expression uneasy. "And let it go. It's just an old key. Probably doesn't even open anything." But Emily couldn't let it go. That night, she began researching the motel and the mysterious death in room 212. What she found sent a shiver down her spine. The man who had died was named Thomas Grayson, a traveling salesman who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The police had ruled his death an accident, but rumors swirled that he had been involved in something dangerous, something that had gotten him killed. Emily's investigation led her to an abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of town. The key fit perfectly into one of the locks. Inside, they found a dusty box filled with old documents, photographs, and a journal. As Emily flipped through the pages, she realized the truth. Thomas Grayson had been blackmailing someone, a powerful local figure, with evidence of their crimes. The man had been silenced before he could expose the truth. That night, as Emily and Jake sat in their living room, the journal open on the coffee table, the lights flickered, the temperature in the room dropped, and a familiar whisper filled the air. "Thank you." Emily's breath caught in her throat as a shadowy figure materialized in the corner of the room. It was Thomas Grayson, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes filled with gratitude. "You found the truth," he said, his voice barely audible. "Now I can rest." And with that, he vanished, leaving Emily and Jake in stunned silence. The key, the journal, and the whispers, it had all been leading to this moment. Justice had finally been served, and the restless spirit of room 212 could finally find peace. But as they sat there, the faint sound of shuffling beneath their own bed reminded them that some secrets are never truly buried. Emily and Jake thought their ordeal was over. Thomas Grayson's spirit had seemingly found peace, and the key to his mystery had been uncovered. But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen in their home. It started small, a faint whisper in the dead of night, a shadow darting across the hallway, the feeling of being watched when no one was there. Emily tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. One night, as they lay in bed, the shuffling sound returned. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, deliberate, and coming from beneath their bed. Emily's heart raced as she clutched Jake's arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his face pale. "It's back." Before they could react, the whisper came again, louder and more urgent than before. "He's still here." Emily's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" "We found the truth. We helped him." The room grew icy, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on them. The lamp on the nightstand flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. From beneath the bed, a low, guttural growl emerged, followed by a chilling laugh. "You think it's over?" A voice hissed, deeper and more menacing than Thomas's whisper. "You've only awakened me." The next morning, Emily and Jake were exhausted. Neither of them had slept, and the atmosphere in their home felt oppressive. They decided to return to the motel, hoping to find answers. When they arrived, the receptionist's face fell as soon as she saw them. "You're back," she said, her voice trembling. "I was hoping you wouldn't be." "What do you mean?" Jake demanded. "What aren't you telling us?" The receptionist hesitated, then sighed. "Room 212. It's not just Thomas Grayson's spirit that haunts it. There's something else. Something darker. Thomas wasn't the only one who died in that room. Decades ago, a serial killer used the motel as his hunting ground. He would hide under the beds, waiting for his victims. When he was finally caught, he swore he'd never stop. They say his spirit is tied to the room, and he feeds on fear." Emily's stomach churned. "So when we helped Thomas, we woke him up?" The receptionist nodded grimly. "You disturbed the balance. Now he's free to torment anyone who enters that room, or anyone connected to it." Desperate for answers, Emily and Jake decided to visit the local library, hoping to find more information about the serial killer. What they discovered was horrifying. The killer, known as the Bedroom Strangler, had murdered over a dozen people in the 1970s. He was never identified, and his victims were buried in unmarked graves. The only clue left behind was a symbol carved into the floor beneath the bed in room 212. A twisted, spiraling mark that resembled an eye. Emily's breath caught as she realized something. "Jake, the key we found, it had a symbol on it. I thought it was just rust, but what if it's the same mark?" They rushed home and examined the key. Sure enough, the faint engraving matched the symbol from the library's records. It was the killer's mark. That night, the disturbances grew worse. Doors slammed shut on their own. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the whispers became screams. Emily and Jake barricaded themselves in their bedroom, but it was no use. The growling voice returned, taunting them. "You can't escape me," it hissed. "I'm in your bed. I'm in your walls. I'm in your minds." Emily clutched the key, her hands shaking. "What do you want from us?" The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "I want you to finish what you started. You freed Thomas, now free me." "Ow!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking. "Find my body," the voice replied. "Bury me properly. Only then will I leave you in peace." The next day, Emily and Jake returned to the storage facility where they had found Thomas's box. This time, they searched deeper, uncovering a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a small, rusted box with the same spiraling symbol. When they opened it, they found a collection of photographs, each one a victim of the bedroom strangler. At the bottom of the box was a map, marked with an X in the woods near the motel. They followed the map, their hearts pounding with every step. The X led them to a shallow grave, hidden beneath a pile of rocks. As they began to dig, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, urging them to hurry. When they finally uncovered the remains, they were met with a horrifying sight. The skeleton was twisted, its hands bound, and its skull bore the same spiraling mark. Emily and Jake worked in silence, burying the remains properly and saying a prayer for the victims. That night, the house was silent. The whispers were gone, the air was clear, and the oppressive feeling had lifted. Emily and Jake finally felt like they could breathe again. But as they lay in bed, exhausted but relieved, Emily noticed something. The key was gone. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where's the key?" He sat up, his eyes wide. "I don't know. I thought you had it." Before they could say another word, the lamp flickered and the room grew cold. From beneath the bed, a faint whisper emerged. "Thank you." But this time, it wasn't Thomas's voice. It was deeper, darker, and filled with malice. Emily and Jake froze, their hearts pounding. The voice laughed, a sound that echoed in their minds long after it faded. "You freed me, but I'll be back." And with that, the room fell silent, leaving them with the chilling realization that some horrors can never truly be laid to rest. Emily and Jake thought they had finally put an end to the nightmare. They had buried the remains of the bedroom strangler, and the house had been quiet for days. But the disappearance of the key gnawed at Emily's mind. It wasn't just a key. It was a symbol, a connection to something far darker than they had realized. One evening, as Emily was cleaning out the storage box they had found in the motel, she discovered something they had missed before. Tucked into the lining of the box was a small, folded piece of paper. It was brittle with age, and the ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "The key is the lock is the door is the end. Break the cycle, or it begins again." Emily's hands trembled as she read the words aloud to Jake. "What does this mean? Break the cycle, what cycle?" Jake frowned, his face pale. "I don't know, but I don't like it. Maybe we should just leave it alone." But Emily couldn't let it go. She felt like they were missing something crucial, something that could explain why the key had vanished and why the voice had promised to return. That night, Emily had a dream. She was back in room 212, but it was different. The walls were covered in the spiraling symbol, glowing faintly in the dark. The bed was gone, replaced by a gaping hole in the floor. From the hole, a faint light emanated, and a voice called to her. "Come closer, see the truth." Emily stepped toward the hole, her heart pounding. As she peered inside, she saw a long, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. At the bottom, she could just make out a door with the same spiraling symbol carved into its surface. She woke up in a cold sweat, the words from the note echoing in her mind. "The key is the lock is the door is the end." Emily and Jake were gone, but their story was far from over. The curse of the key had claimed them, binding their souls to the endless cycle of terror. The motel, now abandoned and crumbling, stood as a grim monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. But the curse was not content to remain confined to room 212. It had grown stronger, feeding on the fear and despair of its victims, and it was spreading. Years later, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon the motel. They had heard the legends, the whispers, the disappearances, the cursed key, but they dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories. Armed with cameras and flashlights, they ventured into the decaying building, eager to document their findings. When they reached room 212, they found it exactly as Emily and Jake had left it. The hole in the floor was still there, the staircase leading down into darkness. One of the explorers, a young woman named Sarah, noticed something glinting in the dust. It was the key, its spiraling symbol faintly glowing. "Guys, look at this," she said, holding it up. "It's the key from the stories." Her friends laughed, but their laughter died when the door beneath the bed creaked open. The air grew cold, and the whispers began. "He's in my bed." Sarah dropped the key, her hands trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The shadows closed in, and the spiraling symbol appeared on the walls, glowing faintly. The explorers tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. The last thing they heard was the voice, whispering in their ears. "You're my bed now." The curse continued to spread, reaching far beyond the motel. The key began to appear in other places, abandoned houses, old hotels, even the homes of unsuspecting families. Each time, it brought with it the same horrors, the whispers, the shadows, the spiraling symbol. Those who found the key were drawn to it, unable to resist its pull, and one by one, they were consumed by the curse. In a small town hundreds of miles away, a young boy found the key in an old trunk in his attic. He didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but he felt drawn to it. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the whispers. "He's in my bed." The boy's parents found him the next morning, his eyes wide with terror, the key clutched tightly in his hand. They tried to take it from him, but it was too late. The curse had already taken hold. The curse of the key was unstoppable, a force of pure evil that fed on fear and despair. It had no beginning and no end, only an endless cycle of terror. Those who encountered it were doomed to become part of it, their souls bound to the darkness forever. And so, the curse continued, spreading like a plague, consuming everything in its path. The key was the lock was the door, and the door was the end. But the end was only the beginning, and the cycle would never be broken. In the depths of room 212, the door beneath the bed creaked open once more, waiting for the next victim to stumble upon its secrets. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the spiraling symbol glowed with an eerie light. Somewhere, in the darkness, a voice whispered, "He's in my bed," and the cycle began again. The wrong floor. The businessman, Thomas Grayson, adjusted his tie as the elevator doors slid shut behind him. The conference had been long, and all he wanted was to collapse into the plush bed of his hotel room on the 9th floor. He pressed the button, the elevator humming softly as it ascended. The mirrored walls reflected his tired face, the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. But when the doors opened, something was wrong. The hallway before him was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. The wallpaper, once elegant, was now faded and peeling, curling at the edges like dead leaves. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. Thomas hesitated, his hand gripping the elevator door to keep it open. This wasn't right. The hotel was supposed to be modern, pristine. This looked like something out of a forgotten, decaying past. He stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked linoleum floor. The room numbers on the doors were nonsensical, letters and numbers jumbled together. A 7X, 23Q, 9 infinity. His heart began to race. He turned back to the elevator, but the doors had already closed, the car descending without him. He jabbed at the call button, but it remained unlit, as if disconnected. At the end of the hallway, a figure appeared. It was a woman, dressed in what might have once been a hotel uniform, now tattered and stained. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step required immense effort. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, and as she turned to face him, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Her face was blurred, shifting like static on an old television, her features impossible to discern. Yet he could feel her gaze, cold and penetrating, locking onto him. Panic surged through him. He pounded on the elevator doors, his voice echoing down the empty hallway. "Hello, is anyone there? Help!" The woman began to move toward him, her steps silent, her static-filled face tilting as if studying him. Thomas's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the doors lining it all identical, all wrong. Finally, the elevator dinged and the door slid open. Thomas stumbled inside, frantically pressing every button on the panel. The doors closed agonizingly slowly, the woman now only a few feet away, her static face flickering as she reached out a hand. Just as the door shut, he thought he heard a whisper, faint and distorted, like a voice coming through a broken radio. When the elevator began to move, Thomas collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. He didn't stop until he reached the lobby, where the bright lights and the hum of conversation felt like a lifeline. He approached the front desk, his voice trembling as he spoke to the receptionist. "There's something wrong with the 9th floor," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The hallway, it's not right. And there was a woman, her face, it was..." The receptionist looked up from her computer, her expression puzzled. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this hotel only has 8 floors. Thomas froze. "No, that's impossible. I was just there. I took the elevator to the 9th floor." The receptionist's smile was polite but firm. "I assure you, sir, there is no 9th floor. Perhaps you were disoriented. The elevators can sometimes be confusing." Thomas stared at her, his mind racing. He knew what he had seen. He had been there. He had felt the oppressive silence, seen the peeling wallpaper, the nonsensical room numbers. And the woman, her static face haunted him, determined to prove it. He demanded to see the building plans. The receptionist hesitated, but eventually called the manager, a stern-faced man with a clipboard. Together, they led Thomas to a small office and pulled out the blueprints. Thomas's heart sank as he stared at the plans. The hotel had 8 floors. There was no 9th floor. "But I was there," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The manager gave him a sympathetic look. "Perhaps you were more tired than you realized, sir. It happens. Why don't we get you a complimentary drink at the bar to help you relax?" Thomas nodded numbly, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. He spent the rest of the evening in the bar, nursing a whiskey, his eyes darting to the elevator every time it dinged. He told himself it was just exhaustion, a trick of the mind, but deep down, he knew better. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. The image of the woman's static face kept flashing in his mind. He tossed and turned, the silence of the room pressing down on him. And then, just as he was about to drift off, he heard it. A faint whisper, distorted and broken, coming from the corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come back." Thomas bolted upright, his heart pounding. The room was dark, but he could see something moving in the shadows. A figure, tattered and blurred, stepping closer. The static face flickered, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come back." Thomas scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. When the lights came on, the room was empty, but the air was cold, and the faint smell of decay lingered. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, he checked out of the hotel, refusing to answer the receptionist's questions about his stay. As he stepped into the sunlight, he felt a momentary relief. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas tried to put the incident behind him. But strange things began to happen. He would hear whispers in empty rooms, see flickering static in the corners of his vision, and every night, without fail, he would dream of the 9th floor, the peeling wallpaper, the nonsensical room numbers, and the woman with the static face. One night, he woke to find himself standing in front of the hotel. He didn't remember driving there, didn't remember leaving his house. The lobby was empty, the reception desk abandoned. The elevator door stood open, waiting. He tried to resist, but his body moved on its own, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed, and the car began to ascend. When they opened, he was back on the 9th floor. The hallway stretched before him, dim and decaying. The woman was there, waiting at the end, her static face flickering. This time, she spoke, her voice a distorted echo. "You shouldn't have come back." Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman reached out, her hand cold and electric, and pulled him into the darkness. The next morning, the hotel staff found the elevator stuck between floors. When they opened the doors, the car was empty, but on the control panel, the button for the 9th floor was lit, even though there was no 9th floor. And in the security footage, just before the elevator stopped, a blurred figure could be seen stepping inside, its face shifting like static. Thomas Grayson was never seen again, but sometimes, late at night, guests at the hotel report hearing whispers in the hallways and seeing a figure with a static face standing at the end of the hall waiting. Because once you find a 9th floor, it never lets you go. Thomas Grayson's disappearance was ruled a mystery. The police investigated, but there was no evidence of foul play. The hotel staff, tight-lipped and uneasy, insisted that Thomas had checked out and left. The security footage, they claimed, showed nothing unusual. But those who worked the night shifts began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of strange noises in the elevators, of flickering lights on the 8th floor, and of a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. A month after Thomas vanished, another guest arrived at the hotel. Her name was Clara Bennett, a travel blogger known for her love of the strange and unexplained. She had heard rumors about the hotel, whispers of disappearances, of guests who checked in but never checked out. Intrigued, she booked a room, determined to uncover the truth. Clara was given a room on the 8th floor. As she unpacked, she noticed something odd. The room number on her key card didn't match the number on her door. The key card read 804, but the door was labeled 809. She frowned, assuming it was a misprint. But as she stepped inside, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. The room was immaculate, but the air felt heavy, as if the walls were pressing in on her. That night, Clara sat at the desk, reviewing her notes. She had researched the hotel's history and discovered that it had been built on the site of an old asylum. The asylum had burned down under mysterious circumstances, and dozens of patients had died. The hotel, it seemed, had inherited its dark past. As she typed, the lights flickered. Clara glanced up, her heart skipping a beat. The room felt colder now, and the silence was unnerving. She shook it off, attributing it to her overactive imagination. But then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. "Help me." Clara froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The whisper came again, louder this time, distorted and broken. "Help me find a 9th floor." She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The corner of the room was dark, but she could see something moving, a shadow, shifting and writhing. And then, for a split second, she saw it. A face, blurred and flickering like static, staring at her from the darkness. Clara screamed, scrambling back from the desk. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the shadow was gone. But the whisper lingered, echoing in her mind. The next morning, Clara approached the front desk, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. She demanded to know about the 9th floor. The receptionist's smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously. "There is no 9th floor, ma'am," she said, her voice tight. Clara wasn't convinced. She spent the day exploring the hotel, searching for clues. She found a maintenance worker who seemed more willing to talk. His name was Carl, and he had worked at the hotel for over a decade. "You're not the first to ask about the 9th floor," Carl said, his voice low. "But you're better off leaving it alone. People who go looking for it, they don't come back." Clara pressed him for more information, and reluctantly, Carl told her about Thomas Grayson. He also mentioned other guests who had vanished over the years, all of whom had reportedly seen or heard something strange. The ninth floor. It's not supposed to exist, Carl said, but sometimes the elevator takes you there anyway. And once you're there, it's like you're trapped. The hotel doesn't let you go. That night, Clara decided to test the theory. She waited until the lobby was empty, then stepped into the elevator. She pressed the button for the 8th floor, but as the elevator ascended, she felt a strange vibration. The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. When the doors opened, she was no longer on the 8th floor. The hallway before her was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling and faded. The room numbers were jumbled, just as Thomas had described. Clara's heart raced, but she forced herself to step out. She had come this far. She wasn't going to turn back now. At the end of the hallway, she saw the woman. Her tattered uniform hung loosely from her frame, and her face was a shifting blur of static. She turned her head slowly, her distorted gaze locking onto Clara. "You shouldn't have come back," the woman whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her curiosity held her in place. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, her static face flickering. "We are the forgotten," she said. "The ones who never left. The asylum, it still holds us." Clara's mind raced. The asylum, the fire, the patients who had died. "What do you want?" she asked. The woman's voice grew louder, more distorted. "We want to be free. But the hotel, it feeds on us. It traps us here in the 9th floor, where time doesn't exist. And it will trap you too." Before Clara could respond, the lights flickered and the hallway began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers crackling with static. "Run," she whispered, before it's too late. Clara turned and bolted for the elevator, her heart pounding. The doors were closing, and she barely made it inside. As the elevator descended, she collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The next morning, Clara checked out of the hotel. She didn't tell anyone what she had seen, but she knew she couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. She spent weeks researching the asylum, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What she found horrified her. The asylum had been a place of unspeakable cruelty. Patients had been subjected to horrific experiments, and many had died under mysterious circumstances. The fire that destroyed the asylum had been no accident. It had been set by the staff to cover up their crimes. But the patients, it seemed, had never left. Clara realized that the 9th floor was a manifestation of their suffering, a liminal space where the spirits of the dead were trapped. The hotel, built on the asylum's ruins, had become a prison for their souls. And the woman with the static face, she was one of them, a victim of the asylum's horrors. Clara tried to move on, but the 9th floor haunted her. She began to see the woman in her dreams, her static face flickering as she whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." And sometimes, when she was alone, she would hear the faint hum of static, as if the 9th floor was calling to her. One night, Clara woke to find herself standing in front of the hotel. The lobby was empty, the elevator doors open. She tried to resist, but her body moved on its own, stepping inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began to ascend. When they opened, she was back on the 9th floor. The woman was waiting for her, her static face flickering. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered. But this time, Clara didn't run. She reached out a hand, her voice steady. "I'm here to help you." The woman's face shifted, the static clearing for a moment. And in that moment, Clara saw her true face, a young woman, her eyes filled with pain and hope. The lights flickered, and the hallway began to dissolve. Clara felt a surge of energy, a release of something long trapped. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, The hotel staff found the elevator stuck between floors. When they opened the doors, the car was empty. But on the control panel, the button for the ninth floor was gone. Clara Bennett was never seen again. But the strange occurrences at the hotel stopped. The whispers ceased, the flickering lights steadied, and the cold drafts disappeared. The ninth floor, it seemed, had finally been laid to rest. Or so they thought, because sometimes, late at night, guests still report hearing a faint hum of static and seeing a blurred figure standing at the end of the hall, her face flickering like a broken television. And they say that if you listen closely, you can hear her whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." The hotel, now rebranded as the Grand Horizon, tried to distance itself from its dark past. The management scrubbed every mention of the ninth floor from their records, and the staff was instructed to deny any rumors of hauntings or disappearances. But the whispers never truly stopped. They lingered in the corners of the lobby, in the creaks of the old elevators, and in the dreams of those who dared to stay the night. Enter Marcus Hale, a paranormal investigator with a reputation for debunking haunted locations. He had heard the stories about the Grand Horizon and was determined to prove them false. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and a healthy dose of skepticism, Marcus checked into the hotel, requesting a room on the 8th floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Emily, hesitated as she handed him a key card. "Room 808, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you hear anything unusual, please don't investigate. Just call the front desk." Marcus smirked. "Unusual is what I'm here for." That night, Marcus set up his equipment, covering every corner of the room with cameras and microphones. He sat on the bed, reviewing the hotel's history on his laptop. The asylum fire, the disappearances, the whispers of the ninth floor. It was all fascinating, but Marcus was convinced it was nothing more than urban legend. As the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered. Marcus glanced up, his heart skipping a beat. The room felt colder, the air heavier. He checked his equipment, but everything was functioning normally. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. "Find us." Marcus froze, his eyes darting to the corner. The whisper came again, louder this time, distorted and broken. "Find us on the 9th floor." He grabbed his flashlight and approached the corner, his camera rolling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and then he saw it, a shadow, shifting and writhing. And within the shadow, a face, blurred and flickering like static. Marcus stumbled back, his skepticism crumbling. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The shadow shifted, the static face tilting unnaturally. "We are the forgotten," it whispered, "the ones who never left. Help us find the 9th floor." Before Marcus could respond, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whisper became a chorus of voices, overlapping and distorted. He fumbled for his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew colder, and he felt a hand, cold and electric, grip his wrist. He screamed, yanking his arm free, and bolted for the door. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling and faded. The room numbers were jumbled, just as Clara had described. Marcus realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was no longer on the 8th floor. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the air thick with the scent of decay. At the end of the hall, the woman stood, her static face flickering. She reached out a hand, her voice a distorted echo. "You shouldn't have come back." Marcus turned and ran, but the hallway seemed to shift and twist, leading him in circles. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in. He stumbled into an open room, slamming the door shut behind him. The room was empty, save for an old television in the corner. The screen flickered to life, showing static at first, then shifting to an image of the hotel lobby. Marcus watched in horror as the screen showed him entering the hotel, checking in, and stepping into the elevator. But when the elevator doors opened, he wasn't on the 8th floor. He was on the 9th floor, just as he was now. The screen shifted again, showing Clara Bennett. She was standing in the same room, her face pale and terrified. The static woman appeared behind her, reaching out a hand. Clara turned, her eyes wide with fear, and then the screen went black. Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that Clara had never left the 9th floor, and neither would he. The door to the room creaked open, and the static woman stepped inside. Her face shifted, the static clearing for a moment, revealing the face of a young woman. She spoke, her voice soft and pleading. "We are trapped here," she said. "The hotel feeds on us, keeping us in this liminal space. But you can help us." Marcus shook his head, his voice trembling. How? How can I help you?" The woman reached out a hand, her fingers crackling with static. "Break the cycle," she whispered. "Find the source of the hotel's power and destroy it. Only then can we be free." Before Marcus could respond, the room began to dissolve. The walls crumbled, the floor giving way beneath him. He fell into darkness, the whispers growing louder, more distorted. And then, everything went silent. The next morning, the hotel staff found Marcus's equipment in room 808, but there was no sign of him. The cameras had captured hours of footage, but the last few minutes were nothing but static. The audio recordings were filled with whispers, overlapping and distorted, but one phrase stood out. "Find the source." Emily, the receptionist, watched the footage with growing dread. She had always believed the stories were just rumors, but now she wasn't so sure. That night, as she locked up the lobby, she heard a faint hum of static coming from the elevator. The doors opened on their own, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Emily hesitated, then stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began to ascend. When they opened, she was on the 9th floor. The hallway stretched before her, the wallpaper peeling and faded. At the end of the hall, the woman stood, her static face flickering. She reached out a hand, her voice a distorted whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." But Emily didn't run. She stepped out of the elevator, her heart pounding. "I'm here to help," she said. The woman's face shifted, the static clearing for a moment. And in that moment, Emily saw her true face, a young woman, her eyes filled with pain and hope. The lights flickered, and the hallway began to dissolve. Emily felt a surge of energy, a release of something long trapped. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the hotel staff found the elevator stuck between floors. When they opened the doors, the car was empty. But on the control panel, the button for the 9th floor was gone. Emily was never seen again. But the strange occurrences at the hotel stopped. The whispers ceased, the flickering lights steadied, and the cold drafts disappeared. The 9th floor, it seemed, had finally been laid to rest. Or so they thought, because sometimes, late at night, guests still report hearing a faint hum of static and seeing a blurred figure standing at the end of the hall, her face flickering like a broken television. And they say that if you listen closely, you can hear her whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." The hotel, now eerily silent, stood as a monument to its dark past. The staff, though relieved by the sudden cessation of paranormal activity, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker, and the silence too absolute. It was as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. Months after Emily's disappearance, a man arrived at the hotel. His name was Victor Langston, the grandson of the hotel's original architect, Elias Langston. Victor had inherited a box of his grandfather's belongings after his death, and among the blueprints and journals, he found something disturbing, a hidden compartment containing a strange, ancient artifact. The artifact was a small, obsidian box covered in intricate carvings of faces that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of the eye. Along with the box was a journal, its pages filled with Elias's frantic handwriting. The entry spoke of a deal he had made to ensure the hotel's success, a deal with something otherworldly. Victor, determined to uncover the truth, traveled to the hotel. He checked into room 808, the same room Marcus and Clara had stayed in. As he unpacked, he felt a strange energy in the air, a hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. He opened the obsidian box, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, Victor was no longer in his room. He stood in the 9th floor hallway, the peeling wallpaper and jumbled room numbers surrounding him. At the end of the hall, the static woman stood, her face flickering. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her were dozens of figures, their faces blurred and shifting, their forms flickering like broken television screens. "You've come to finish what your grandfather started," the static woman said, her voice a distorted echo. Victor's heart raced. "What are you talking about? What did he do?" The woman stepped closer, her static face clearing for a moment to reveal a look of sorrow. "Your grandfather made a deal with the entity that resides here. He promised his souls in exchange for the hotel's success. But the entity is never satisfied. It feeds on us, trapping us here in this liminal space. And now it wants you." Victor shook his head, his mind reeling. "I didn't agree to this. I don't want any part of it." The woman's face shifted back to static, her voice growing louder, more distorted. "It doesn't matter. The artifact binds you to the entity. You cannot escape." Victor looked down at the obsidian box in his hands. The carvings seemed to pulse, the faces writhing as if alive. He realized with a sinking feeling that the box was the source of the hotel's power and the key to breaking the cycle. The static woman reached out a hand, her fingers crackling with energy. "Destroy the box," she whispered. "But know this, the entity will not let you go easily. It will fight to keep its hold on this place." Victor hesitated, his hands trembling. "What happens if I destroy it?" "The 9th floor will collapse," the woman said. "We will be free. But you may not survive." Victor took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. He raised the box above his head and brought it down with all his strength, smashing it against the floor. The hallway erupted in chaos. The walls began to crumble, the floor cracking and splitting apart. The static figures screamed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of pain and relief. The air grew thick with energy, and Victor felt himself being pulled into the void. As the 9th floor collapsed, the static woman reached out to him, her face clearing one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and sincere. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the hotel staff found the elevator stuck between floors. When they opened the doors, the car was empty, but on the control panel, the button for the 9th floor was gone. Victor Langston was never seen again, but the strange occurrences at the hotel stopped. The whispers ceased, the flickering lights steadied, and the cold drafts disappeared. The 9th floor, it seemed, had finally been destroyed, or so they thought, because sometimes, late at night, guests still report hearing a faint hum of static and seeing a blurred figure standing at the end of the hall, her face flickering like a broken television. And they say that if you listen closely, you can hear her whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." But now, there's a new twist. Some guests claim to see a man in the shadows, his face blurred and shifting, his eyes filled with regret. They say he stands beside the static woman, his hand resting on her shoulder, as if trying to protect her. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to approach, he'll turn to you and whisper, "The 9th floor is gone, but the entity is still here." The breathing in the closet. The old hotel stood at the edge of the town, its weathered facade leaning slightly to one side as if burdened by the weight of its own history. The solo traveler, a man named Daniel, had chosen it on a whim, lured by its cheap rates and the promise of a quiet night. But as he stepped into the dimly lit lobby, a chill crept up his spine. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. The receptionist, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, handed him a brass key and pointed him toward the staircase without a word. Daniel's room was on the third floor, at the end of a long, creaking hallway. The door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a sparse room with peeling wallpaper and a single, flickering bulb. But it was the closet that caught his attention, a massive, ornate wooden structure in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. Something about it made his skin crawl. Brushing off the unease, Daniel unpacked his belongings and tried to settle in. The bed groaned under his weight, and the sheets smelled faintly of dust and decay. Exhausted from his journey, he eventually drifted into a restless sleep. It was the sound that woke him, a slow, raspy breathing, like air being dragged through a broken throat. Daniel's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. The room was pitch black, the flickering bulb now dead. The breathing was coming from the closet. He froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something or someone was waiting. Trembling, Daniel reached for his phone and fumbled with the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the closet door. The breathing stopped. He stared at the door, his breath shallow, his mind racing. It was just the old building settling, he told himself. Just his imagination. He forced himself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Daniel packed his things quickly, eager to leave the room behind. As he handed the key back to the receptionist, he casually mentioned the noise. That closet in the corner. It made this weird breathing sound last night. Creepy, huh? The receptionist's face went pale. He stiffened, his fingers tightening around the key. Sir, that closet has been nailed shut for years. Daniel's blood ran cold. What do you mean? The doors were open when I got here. The receptionist shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. No one's been in that room for over a decade. Not since the incident. Daniel's throat went dry. What incident? The man hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone, or something, might overhear. There was a traveler, like you. He stayed in that room. On the second night, he disappeared. The police found blood all over the walls, but no body. They nailed the closet shut after that. No one's opened it since. Daniel's mind raced. He had seen the closet open. He had heard the breathing. But I saw it. I heard it. The receptionist's eyes widened. You opened it. No, it was already open when I got there. The man's face twisted in fear. Then it let you in. Before Daniel could respond, the receptionist turned and hurried into a back room, locking the door behind him. Daniel stood there, stunned, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He needed to leave. Now. But as he stepped outside, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from his cloud storage. A new photo had been uploaded overnight. Confused, he opened it, and his stomach dropped. It was a picture of him, taken last night as he slept. The angle was unmistakable. It had been taken from inside the closet, his hands shaking. Daniel scrolled to the next photo. It was a close-up of his face, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in sleep. The timestamp showed it had been taken just minutes before he woke up to the breathing. And then he saw it. In the background of the photo, barely visible in the shadows of the closet, was a figure, a hunched skeletal shape with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It was holding the phone, its bony fingers curled around the edges. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at the hotel, its windows dark and lifeless. The receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty. And as he stared, he noticed something else. The window of his room was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. But he had never opened it. His phone buzzed again. Another photo. This one was taken from outside the hotel. It showed him standing on the sidewalk, his back to the camera, staring up at the building. The timestamp was from 5 minutes ago. Daniel spun around, his heart pounding. The street was empty. He was alone, or so he thought. As he turned back toward the hotel, he saw it. The closet door, now wide open, visible through the window of his room. And, standing in the doorway, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure from the photo. It was watching him. Daniel ran. He didn't look back. He didn't stop until he was miles away, his lungs burning, his legs trembling. But even as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something had followed him. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel tried to put the incident behind him, but the photos kept coming. Every night, a new one appeared in his cloud storage. Pictures of him sleeping, pictures of him walking down the street, pictures of him sitting in his living room, unaware of the camera's gaze. And in every photo, the figure was there, sometimes in the background, sometimes just out of frame, but always watching, always waiting. Daniel changed his phone. He changed his locks. He even moved to a new city. But the photos kept coming, and with each one, the figure grew closer, its smile wider, its eyes darker, until one night, Daniel woke up to the sound of slow, raspy breathing. He reached for his phone, his hands trembling, and opened the latest photo. It was taken from inside his bedroom. The figure was standing at the foot of his bed, its face inches from the camera. Its mouth was open, its teeth jagged and yellow, and in its hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. The caption read, "Time to close the closet," and then the breathing stopped. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would burst through his chest. He dropped the phone as if it had burned him, the screen still glowing with the grotesque image. The room was silent now, the raspy breathing gone, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He scrambled out of bed, his legs tangling in the sheets, and lunged for the light switch. The sudden brightness did little to calm his nerves. The room was empty, or so it seemed. But the closet, his new apartment, didn't have a closet like the one in the hotel, just a small, modern sliding door. Yet, as he stared at it, he noticed something. The door was slightly ajar, just like the one in the hotel. He hadn't left it open. He was sure of it. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he approached the closet, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He yanked it open, half expecting to see the skeletal figure grinning back at him. But there was nothing, just his clothes hanging neatly, exactly as he'd left them. He let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. The photos, the breathing, the figure. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Someone was messing with him. That was the only explanation. But deep down, he knew better. The next few days were a blur. Daniel barely slept, jumping at every creak and whisper of the wind. He installed security cameras in his apartment, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was tormenting him. The photos stopped coming, but the sense of being watched never left. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The shadows in his apartment seemed darker, deeper, as if they were alive. One night, exhausted from days of paranoia, Daniel finally succumbed to sleep. He dreamed of the hotel, of the closet, of the figure with its jagged teeth and hollow eyes. In the dream, he was back in that room, the closet door wide open. The figure stepped out, its movements jerky and unnatural, and began to crawl toward him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached for him, its bony fingers brushing his face. Daniel woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, the security cameras blinking softly in the darkness. He reached for his phone to check the footage, but before he could, a notification popped up. Another photo. His stomach churned as he opened it. The photo was taken from inside his apartment. It showed him sleeping, just like the others. But this time, the figure wasn't in the background. It was standing over him, its face inches from his, Its grotesque smile stretched impossibly wide, and in its hand was the hammer and nail, poised as if ready to strike. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He looked around the room, but it was empty. The cameras hadn't picked up anything. He rewound the footage, his hands shaking, but there was no sign of the figure. Just him, tossing and turning in his sleep. He couldn't take it anymore. He packed a bag and fled the apartment, determined to put as much distance between himself and whatever was haunting him as possible. He drove for hours, finally stopping at a roadside motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a dingy place, but it felt safer than his apartment. He checked in, handed over his cash, and collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to care about the stains on the sheets. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he heard it, the slow, raspy breathing. His heart stopped. He turned his head, dreading what he might see. The closet in the motel room was identical to the one in the hotel. Massive, ornate, and slightly ajar. Daniel bolted upright, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. He was hundreds of miles away from the hotel. How could it be here? He grabbed his phone, ready to call for help, but the screen lit up with another notification. Another photo. This one was different. It wasn't of him. It was of the hotel, the one he had stayed in all those weeks ago. The photo was taken from inside the lobby, looking up at the staircase. And there, at the top of the stairs, was the figure. It was holding a hammer and nail, but this time, it wasn't alone. Standing beside it, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror, was the receptionist, the man who had warned Daniel about the closet. The caption read, "He opened it too." Daniel's hand shook so badly he could barely hold the phone. He stared at the photo, his mind reeling. The receptionist had known something. He tried to warn him, and now he was gone. The breathing grew louder, more labored. Daniel turned toward the closet, his heart pounding. The door was open wider now, the darkness inside impenetrable. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the closet. And then he saw it, a hand, skeletal and gnarled, gripping the edge of the door. The figure emerged slowly, its hollow eyes locked on Daniel, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. In its other hand was the hammer and nail. Daniel finally found his voice. He screamed, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, until it was standing over him. It raised the hammer, the rusted nail glinting in the dim light. The last thing Daniel saw was the figure's smile widening as it brought the hammer down. Weeks later, another traveler checked into the old hotel. The receptionist, a new one with a nervous twitch, handed over the key without a word. The traveler made his way to the room, unaware of the stories, the warnings, the horrors that lurked within. As he unpacked, he glanced at the closet in the corner. The doors were slightly ajar, and from within, the sound of slow, raspy breathing began. The traveler, a young woman named Clara, paused mid-unpacking, her hand hovering over her suitcase. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a low, guttural breathing, like air being dragged through a throat filled with gravel. She turned toward the closet, her heart skipping a beat. The doors were slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness within. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The breathing stopped. Clara shook her head, trying to laugh it off. "Get it together," she muttered to herself. "It's just an old building, probably the wind or something." But the air in the room felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, like the walls were pressing in on her. She quickly finished unpacking and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The light from the bedside lamp did little to dispel the unease settling in her chest. She reached over to turn it off, but hesitated. Something about the darkness felt dangerous. Finally, she left the light on and closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But the moment she drifted off, the sound returned, louder this time, more deliberate. Clara's eyes snapped open. The breathing was coming from the closet again, but now it was accompanied by something else. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across her. She sat up, her pulse racing. The closet door was still ajar, but now she could see something moving in the shadows. A shape, hunched and skeletal, shifting just out of sight. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely unlock it. She opened the camera app and pointed it at the closet, zooming in on the darkness. The screen flickered, then went black. When the image returned, Clara's blood turned to ice. The figure was there, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. And in its hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. Clara dropped the phone and scrambled out of bed, backing away from the closet. The figure didn't move, but its smile widened, its head tilting to one side as if amused by her fear. She turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. The receptionist was at the far end, mopping the floor. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "There's something in my room." Clara gasped, her voice shrill with panic. "In the closet. It's watching me." The receptionist's face went pale. He set the mop aside and grabbed a set of keys from his pocket. "Show me," he said, his voice tight. Clara led him back to the room, her heart pounding. The door was still open, the closet visible from the hallway. The receptionist stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he approached the closet. Clara hung back, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's in there," she whispered. "I saw it. It had a hammer in." The receptionist yanked the closet door open, revealing nothing but empty space. Clara stared, her mind reeling. "No, it was there. I saw it." The man turned to her, his expression grim. "This closet hasn't been opened in years," he said. "Not since the last guest." Clara's stomach churned. "What happened to them?" The receptionist hesitated, then sighed. "They disappeared, just like the ones before them. This room, it's cursed. The closet, the figure, it's been here for as long as the hotel has. No one knows where it came from, but it takes people. And once it chooses you, there's no escape." Clara's knees went weak. "What do you mean it chooses you?" The man's eyes darkened. "It marks you. Once it's seen you, it won't stop until it has you. And when it does," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the closet, "you'll wish you'd never come here." Clara's mind raced. She had to get out. Now. She grabbed her suitcase and bolted for the door, not bothering to pack properly. The receptionist didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, watching her go, his expression unreadable. She drove for hours, not stopping until she was miles away from the hotel. She checked into a different motel, one that felt safer, more modern. There was no closet in the room, just a small wardrobe. She locked the door, set her suitcase down, and collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she heard it, the slow, raspy breathing. Her heart stopped. She turned her head, dreading what she might see. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone, her hand shaking, and opened the camera app. She pointed it at the wardrobe, zooming in on the darkness. The screen flickered, then went black. When the image returned, Clara's blood turned to ice. The figure was there, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. And in its hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. The caption read, "You can't run." Months later, another traveler checked into the old hotel. The receptionist, a new one with a nervous twitch, handed over the key without a word. The traveler made his way to the room, unaware of the stories, the warnings, the horrors that lurked within. As he unpacked, he glanced at the closet in the corner. The doors were slightly ajar, and from within, the sound of slow, raspy breathing began. The traveler, a man named Ethan, froze mid-motion, his hand clutching a folded shirt. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a low, guttural breathing, like air being dragged through a throat filled with gravel. He turned toward the closet, his heart skipping a beat. The doors were slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness within. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. The breathing stopped. Ethan shook his head, trying to laugh it off. "Get together," he muttered to himself. "It's just an old building. Probably the wind or something." But the air in the room felt wrong. Heavy, oppressive, like the walls were pressing in on him. He quickly finished unpacking and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. The light from the bedside lamp did little to dispel the unease settling in his chest. He reached over to turn it off, but hesitated. Something about the darkness felt dangerous. Finally, he left the light on and closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. But the moment he drifted off, the sound returned, louder this time, more deliberate. Ethan's eyes snapped open. The breathing was coming from the closet again, but now it was accompanied by something else. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. He sat up, his pulse racing. The closet door was still ajar, but now he could see something moving in the shadows. A shape, hunched and skeletal, shifting just out of sight. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone, his hand shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. He opened the camera app and pointed it at the closet, zooming in on the darkness. The screen flickered, then went black. When the image returned, Ethan's blood turned to ice. The figure was there, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. And in its hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. Ethan dropped the phone and scrambled out of bed, backing away from the closet. The figure didn't move, but its smile widened, its head tilting to one side as if amused by his fear. He turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. The receptionist was at the far end, mopping the floor. He looked up as Ethan approached, his expression unreadable. "There's something in my room." Ethan gasped, his voice shrill with panic. "In the closet. It's watching me." The receptionist's face went pale. He set the mop aside and grabbed a set of keys from his pocket. "Show me," he said, his voice tight. Ethan led him back to the room, his heart pounding. The door was still open, the closet visible from the hallway. The receptionist stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he approached the closet. Ethan hung back, his arms wrapped around himself. "It's in there," he whispered. "I saw it. It had a hammer in." The receptionist yanked the closet door open, revealing nothing but empty space. Ethan stared, his mind reeling. "No, it was there. I saw it." The man turned to him, his expression grim. "This closet hasn't been opened in years," he said. "Not since the last guest." Ethan's stomach churned. What happened to them? The receptionist hesitated, then sighed. "They disappeared, just like the ones before them. This room, it's cursed. The closet, the figure, it's been here for as long as the hotel has. No one knows where it came from, but it takes people, and once it chooses you, there's no escape." Ethan's knees went weak. "What do you mean it chooses you?" The man's eyes darkened. "It marks you. Once it's seen you, it won't stop until it has you. And when it does," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the closet, "you'll wish you'd never come here." Ethan's mind raced. He had to get out. Now. He grabbed his suitcase and bolted for the door, not bothering to pack properly. The receptionist didn't try to stop him. He just stood there, watching him go, his expression unreadable. He drove for hours, not stopping until he was miles away from the hotel. He checked into a different motel, one that felt safer, more modern. There was no closet in the room, just a small wardrobe. He locked the door, set his suitcase down, and collapsed onto the bed, his body trembling with exhaustion. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he heard it, the slow, raspy breathing. His heart stopped. He turned his head, dreading what he might see. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking, and opened the camera app. He pointed it at the wardrobe, zooming in on the darkness. The screen flickered, then went black. When the image returned, Ethan's blood turned to ice. The figure was there, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. And in its hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. The caption read, "You can't run." Months later, another traveler checked into the old hotel. The receptionist, a new one with a nervous twitch, handed over the key without a word. The traveler made his way to the room, unaware of the stories, the warnings, the horrors that lurked within. As he unpacked, he glanced at the closet in the corner. The doors were slightly ajar, and from within, the sound of slow, raspy breathing began. Ethan's story didn't end in the motel. It didn't end with the wardrobe, or the figure, or the hammer and nail. It didn't end because the figure wasn't just a ghost, a demon, or a curse. It was something far worse. Something ancient. Something alive. Ethan tried to run. He changed cities, changed countries, even changed his name. But no matter where he went, the figure followed. It wasn't just in closets anymore. It was in mirrors, in photographs, in the shadows of his dreams. Every night, the breathing grew louder. Every night, the figure came closer. And every night, the hammer and nail gleamed in the dim light, waiting. He tried everything to escape. He consulted priests, psychics, and paranormal investigators. He performed rituals, burned sage, and even tried to confront the figure directly. But nothing worked. The figure was always there, always watching, always smiling. One night, desperate and broken, Ethan returned to the hotel. He didn't know why. Maybe he thought he could end it there, where it all began. Maybe he just didn't have anywhere else to go. The receptionist was the same one who had warned him months ago. He didn't seem surprised to see Ethan. He just handed over the key and said, "Room 13. It's waiting for you." Ethan's hand shook as he unlocked the door. The room was exactly as he remembered it. The peeling wallpaper, the flickering bulb, the massive wooden closet in the corner. The doors were slightly ajar. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic like blood. He approached the closet, his legs trembling, and yanked the doors open. It was empty. For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the figure was gone. And then he heard it, the slow, raspy breathing. But it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from behind him. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was there, its hollow eyes staring into his, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile. In its hand was the hammer and nail. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised the hammer, its smile widening, and brought it down. When Ethan woke up, he was in the closet. The doors were nailed shut from the outside. He pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but no one came. The air was thick and suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around him. And then he saw it, a small, rusted nail lying on the floor. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and realized it wasn't just a nail. It was a key. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The nail was the key to his escape. All he had to do was use it. But use it how? The breathing started again, slow and raspy. But this time it wasn't coming from outside the closet. It was coming from inside, from him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at his hands and saw they were changing. His skin was turning gray and brittle, his fingers elongating into bony claws. He stumbled back, his reflection catching in the polished wood of the closet door. The figure staring back at him wasn't the one he had seen before. It was him, his hollow eyes, his jagged teeth, his grotesque smile. And in his hand was the hammer and nail. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out was a slow, raspy breath. Months later, another traveler checked into the old hotel. The receptionist, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, handed over the key without a word. The traveler made his way to the room, unaware of the stories, the warnings, the horrors that lurked within. As he unpacked, he glanced at the closet in the corner. The doors were slightly ajar, and from within, the sound of slow, raspy breathing began. But this time, the figure wasn't alone. Beside it, barely visible in the shadows, was Ethan. His hollow eyes stared into the darkness, his jagged teeth bared in a grotesque smile, and in his hand was a hammer and a single, rusted nail. The cycle had begun again, and it would never end. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.